webinars are made possible thanks to generous donor support. If you'd like to contribute, please visit our website, autism.org.
And now, before we get started, I'll introduce our speaker. Since 2003, Dr. Fakhri Shafai has worked with autistic persons, their families, clinicians, and educators in various capacities. Her research is focused on sensory processing differences in autism spectrum disorder and how these differences are related to social competence, emotional processing, and anxiety. Currently, she works as the Research and Evaluation Project Coordinator for AIDE Canada, a federally funded nonprofit that seeks to support autistic individuals, individuals with intellectual disabilities, and their families. And now I will turn it over to Fakhri.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to launch right in. Oops. Okay, there we go. So today we will start by talking about just sensory processing in general. We'll dive into brain development, and then we'll talk about how sensory systems change as we age and what we do and do not know about that process in autistic individuals. And then I will discuss some limitations and future directions. Most of us are familiar with the 5 senses: sound, sight, taste, smell, and touch. But there are other sensory systems also. There's the vestibular system, which assists us with movement and balance. There's proprioception, which is where our body is in space. And some people ask me, what do I mean by that? So if you're able to put on a jacket without watching your arm go through the sleeve, if you're able to put on a backpack without looking, you are using your proprioceptive system and understanding where your body is in space in relation to objects around you. And then there's interoception. And interoception is really about understanding what is happening inside your body, recognizing cues of hunger or being too full or needing to use the washroom. We know that sensory processing differences have been described in autism since the very first descriptions by Kanner. But it wasn't until the DSM-5 in 2013 that sensory issues were part of the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder. And in that document, they say individuals are experiencing sensory aspects of the world in an unusual or extreme way. And some examples include an indifference to pain or temperature, excessive smelling or touching of objects, fascination with lights and movement, and being overwhelmed with loud noises. We know that sensory processing differences are found in 93 to 96% of children on the spectrum and autistic youth. And they experience these differences in such a way that they significantly impact daily function. And much of the research has focused on children. However, we do know that these sensory processing differences don't go away as you age. In fact, we know that up to 95% of autistic adults also report extreme levels of sensory processing on at least one sensory system. So we see that sensory difficulties are across the lifespan. This is not something that is just found in children. There have been a number of studies that have looked at how sensory processing is related to autistic traits. So we find that the more sensory symptoms a person has, the more likely it is that they have autistic traits. And that goes whether we're talking about children, whether we're talking about adults, and even neurotypical adults fit into this. Neurotypical adults with more sensory systems will score higher on measures of autistic traits, even if they are not autistic themselves. And we find this in siblings over and over again. There's numerous studies. I've just brought up a few for our viewers, but in general, the more sensory symptoms a person has, the more autistic traits they have. Before we can really dive into what we mean with this, I'd like to talk about something called the optimal attention and arousal window. And this window describes when we are both alert and calm. And if we view a typical day a person might have, you'll notice that sometimes we get above that or below that window depending on what's happening. So for instance, in the morning, if you're driving to work and you're a little bit tired, you might be below the optimal attention and arousal window, and then you will do something to bring yourself up. So if I'm driving to work, I might roll down the windows to get that extra sensory input so that I can be more alert. But later in the day, maybe you've had a stressful meeting, or you're driving home from work and there's lots of traffic and you're starting to feel overwhelmed. You might take some deep breaths to calm down, or if you're in a stressful driving situation, you might reduce your sensory input by turning off the music, rolling up the windows, reducing the amount of sensory input you have around you so that you can focus on the task at hand. And we all do this throughout the day. What's different in autism, so that's the previous slide. What's different in autism is we can get too high or too low away from that optimal attention arousal window. So for instance, if we get too high, we're going to enter into something we refer to as hyper-reactivity. You might have also heard of this as hypersensitivity. And when we're in that state, we are going to avoid sensory input. And if we're amped up enough, we might enter into what we call fight, flight, or freeze. So if I'm overwhelmed and there's a lot going on around me, I might try to run away to get away from that sensory input. On the flip side of that, if we get too low, we enter into what we call hypo-reactivity, also hyposensitivity. And in that case, we are going to seek out sensory input. So what's different about autism is that we will get much higher or much lower from that optimal attention and arousal window throughout the day. So if an autistic person is feeling hyporeactive, they need some sensory input, they might choose an activity that will bring them up. So they might chew on something with different textures or do something to increase their sensory input and to help them become more alert. The difference is sometimes the activities that are chosen can sometimes cause the person to overshoot and go too far in the other direction. Similarly, if a person is in a hyper-reactive state and they're feeling too much sensory input, they might do something to reduce that, like use noise-canceling headphones so that they don't have as much sensory input coming in. And I'd like to stress again, all of us bounce around this optimal attention and arousal window throughout the day. So how does an autistic individual experience sensory information? This image was part of the National Autistic Society's Too Much Information campaign. And what it really focused on is that hyperreactivity means we are being overwhelmed by sensory information. And if you can't filter out the sensory information that doesn't matter, then you can experience overload. So until I said something, many of the people who are watching right now might not have noticed the feeling of their body in the chair. They might not have noticed the background noise of an air conditioner or a fan. It's not until we adjust our attention that we are aware of this. But for many autistic people, it's a struggle to be able to filter out the information that doesn't matter and focus on the information that does matter in a particular moment. On the flip side of that, There can be hypo-reactivity, which means we are underwhelmed by sensory information. Individuals that are in a hypo-reactive state may take part in activities that should hurt or might be annoying for others, but they don't experience it that way in that moment. So, for instance, a person might not recognize that they've burned themselves on a stove, or they might like really loud music that hurts other people's ears, or they might really love those hard hugs. And individuals who are doing those activities, it is because they are underwhelmed by sensory information, and so they are seeking out sensory experiences. These are also our individuals who love to climb, swing, jump. All of that is to give them some form of sensory input. So, in their own words, bad smells feel quite painful. Strip lighting, that can immediately hurt a lot. Loud noise can bother me, and it can feel painful. If textures of food were mixed, the sensation makes me want to feel physically ill. People brushing past me, it's like pain mixed with panic, and I can become quite aggravated because of it. I'd like to highlight that all of these quotes were taken from adults on the autism spectrum, which tells us that these sensory experiences are not going away. There was an idea in the past that people didn't have as many sensory sensitivities as they age, but what we now know is that in a lot of cases, people have just learned to mask or camouflage their experiences and are actually being overwhelmed by sensory information and just trying to hide it. So it's not that it goes away, it's just that individuals learn either coping strategies or they just hide it from others. So I would like to talk a little bit about sensory seeking behaviors, and I think one of the best ways to do that is through talking about the homunculus. So the homunculus is a visual representation of the brain, and it shows how much real estate in the brain is dedicated to different sensory systems for parts of the body. So the parts that look bigger on this picture mean that more real estate is devoted in the brain to those particular senses. So for instance, the mouth is bigger here, we see the hands are bigger, and that means that the greatest density of tactile receptors are in the hands, mouth, and genitals. So if somebody is seeking out sensory experiences, you will probably see them focusing on those bigger parts of the body because those are where the greatest concentration of nerve receptors are. One question I get asked all the time is, how is it possible that my child can not notice when they've burned themselves or when they have a sunburn? They act like they're not in pain at all, but if I lightly touch them, they react as if it is extremely painful. And the answer is, essentially, we have multiple types of touch receptors, and some of these receptors respond to heat or cold, some sense light touch, some sense pain, and then others sense pressure. And what can happen is that a person's receptors for one type of touch can be heightened, so even little touch can be overwhelming for them and they'll react accordingly, while others can be dampened, and in those cases they won't notice that pain. I also would like to point out that it can change day to day. It's not that a person will always experience the inability to handle light touch. It's just that in certain moments, especially if there's a lot happening around them, they will not be able to filter out the other information and they can become overwhelmed. Similarly, they can be underwhelmed and want to seek out certain types of pressure or pain to help bring them up to that optimal attention and arousal window. And I would also like to point out that it can even change hour to hour for the same individual, depending on what's happening around them. So now we'll talk about brain development a little bit. So the brain develops in layers in the womb. What do I mean by this? I mean that one layer first builds and then another layer and another layer. And this is all happening very early on in the womb. And this is a lovely image that shows each layer in a different color to highlight that every layer is different, and each layer will also have different tasks. We know that neurons or brain cells talk to each other through synapses or connections. We are born with billions of synapses, and we lose the ones we don't use. So each one of those little yellow dots on this picture represents a synapse. So what does this mean? I want you to imagine that you're at the ocean or at sea level. As you travel to higher elevations, you will come across different ecosystems. Each ecosystem has different plants and animals that are adapted for the challenges in that unique environment. If you have a plant or an animal that's moved to a higher elevation, or vice versa, one that's moved to a lower elevation, this can interrupt the balance of the new ecosystem. We know that the brains of people on the autism spectrum show differences starting within the first 3 months in the womb. So don't worry about what these different layers mean. I'm hoping it shows up on your screen, but you should see a red layer on the bottom panel and a green layer on the top. And this is for, these are rat brains, but these are typical rats. There's no genetic differences from wild type. And then when we look at the autistic brain, we see that the neurons for some of the layers kept growing. They moved into the layer above them, and we call that neuronal migration. So this is a rat model, meaning there's a gene that's associated with autism and they're exploring it here. But essentially, the cells didn't stop where they normally do. Some of the cells moved into the layers above them. And this is a rat brain, but we do see the same thing in some, not all, some autistic adults. And we do see that atypical neuronal migration. So don't worry about what layers G and M do. That's beyond what we're talking about here. But I'd like to point out that the dark purple stain is layer G. And so all the cells there should be dark purple. But we see that some of the dark purple cells have moved into layer M. So we have neuronal migration, and this is from an autistic individual who passed and donated their brain to research. So it is thought that this atypical neuronal migration may contribute to the sensory processing differences we see in autism. We also know that it's not just where the cells are, but it's also how they're connected to each other that may be different. So when we are born, as I mentioned before, we have many connections between cells. We have many synapses. And in this picture here, the synapses are represented by these little white offshoots all around the neuron. As we develop, the brain removes connections we don't need. That's called synaptic pruning. So just like if you're a gardener and you prune, you get rid of the parts of the plant you don't want, so that the plant will devote more resources to what you do want, for instance, a rose. In autism, we see more connections between cells that are close to each other, and we refer to that as a failure to prune. So if you look at the image on the right here, we see many more of those little white offshoots that indicate that an individual is that they have more connections. And I would like to point out that failure to prune is kind of misleading. It doesn't mean that autistic individuals don't have any pruning that occurs. It just means that it's slower and there's less pruning that occurs early on in life. So we do see more connections between cells in autistic individuals. So what does this mean? I want you to imagine that you're in a dense forest. If you're in a dense forest and you go in the same direction over and over again, you will eventually create a path. If you take that same path day after day and enough traffic goes along that path will eventually turn into a trail. And with even more traffic, the trail will become a gravel road, then a one-lane street, then a highway. Essentially, the more traffic we have going in a certain direction, the more resources we devote to maintaining that path. And any paths that are not taken eventually become overgrown. What's different in autism? The brains of autistic individuals keep extra paths that are not necessary, so those paths don't become overgrown. If you look at this image here, we have two paths that are going to the exact same place. So this means that a lot of paths are next to each other, are talking at the same time. And if they're talking at that same time, that means that less energy can go towards those big highways for the important things, like getting one part of the brain to talk to another part of the brain that is further away. So in this image here, we see a representation of the energy it takes to send signals. And once again, if we're sending multiple signals to the same place, then we are expending energy that we might not need to use. So how do these paths lead to sensory issues in autism? Don't let this image scare you. Don't worry about what the dots mean. Essentially, what we're showing here is that there are connections between different regions in the brain, and these are more long-distance connections. The thicker the line is, the more of a highway it is, meaning more traffic goes along there. But when we look at this in autistic children, we see that not only are there more paths, but we see many more paths in sensory areas close to each other. So for instance, at the back of the brain here, this is where vision is processed, and you can see that these areas have lines between them, but we don't see those lines between them in typically developing children. So this means we have more connections in those local sensory areas. So we see extra connections, including sensory areas used for vision, hearing, etc. And with those extra connections, it's harder for the brain to filter out the sensory information that isn't important. So what does that mean for those long distance connections between areas of the brain? Again, don't let the image confuse you. Essentially, we're looking at a front view of the brain. And once again, the circles just represent a particular spot in the brain. And what we're focusing on here is the thickness of the line connecting those far apart areas. So in a control, we see the lines are relatively thick. But if we look at autistic individuals, we see that those lines are much thinner. Once again, autistic individuals have all the same spots in the brain. There's nothing missing, but what's different is the way that they're connected and the way that the brain is communicating with other regions within the brain. So we see those weaker connections in areas far apart from each other, and this is especially important because the sensory areas and their connections to the social parts of the brain are reduced. So with those weaker long distance connections, it's harder for the brain to make sense of what it is seeing, hearing, or feeling in social contexts. Now let's talk a little bit about multisensory issues in autism. So multisensory means more than one sense being used to process an event. So for instance, when somebody is talking, you are both looking at them, seeing their mouth move, and putting that information together with what you're hearing. Or if you're tasting food, you are both feeling the texture in your mouth and the taste and the smells associated with that particular food. Or you might smell shampoo while you're rubbing your fingers into your hair when you're washing your hair. So all of these are things where multiple senses are coming together around one event or one activity. So when we put two or more senses together at once, we call that multisensory integration. So in multisensory integration, research has shown that for some autistic children, they have trouble putting sound and sight together at the same time. I want to walk you through this image and explain a few things. First, the top panel is a typically developing individual. Actually, it's the combination of all the typically developing individuals in that particular study. And then the bottom image are autistic individuals in that study. And this is for an audio-visual task. So at the back of the brain, that's where vision is. And over here in the temporal area, that's where auditory processing occurs. And this area between them is where that information is put together. That's where we call multisensory integration. Now, it looks like it's not happening at all in autistic individuals, and that's misleading. Essentially, what this is showing is that there's less activity for autistic individuals, and it is happening at a slower time scale. So it's not that the information isn't being put together at all, it's just that it's slower and at a reduced rate in general. So we're not showing as much activity in multisensory integration regions. So for children that do have this difficulty, when a person talks, it is almost always out of sync for them. The face and the words don't match. And all of us have experienced this when we load a TV show or a movie and somehow the sound and the visual don't line up, and lips are not moving at the same rate as what we're hearing, and it can be confusing and frustrating. And many of us will choose to reload the video so that we can avoid that issue. But for many autistic individuals, they're not able to do that because this is what's happening either all the time or when they're overwhelmed with other sensory information at a particular moment. And so for many of them, they will choose either to look at you or to listen to you. They won't do both at the same time. And so this is why it's extremely important to give autistic individuals extra time to process what you said. Everybody needs time to put the information together in general, but we need to allow more time for autistic individuals to be able to do that. Okay, so we've talked sensory processing, we've talked brain development. Now we're going to talk about the sensory systems and aging. So for the auditory system, the basics of the auditory system for neurotypical individuals mature at about 6 months. But these auditory processing skills are fine-tuned all the way into the late teens. But once we hit about the age of 40, things start to degrade. If a person is hyperreactive or over-responsive to certain sounds, they may avoid certain sounds or they may startle easy. These are signs that a person is being overwhelmed by that information. And signs of hypo-reactivity or under-responsivity, individuals who are experiencing this may do things like bang objects, shout when speaking, turn the music up really loud to get that additional sensory input. Now, we have studies of autistic children. We have studies of autistic adolescents and young adults. We have far fewer studies of sensory processing, or really far fewer studies, period, of older adults, especially once we enter into the elder years. So we don't know a whole lot about how this aging process and this sensory processing changes that occur over the lifetime. We don't know a whole lot about how that happens in autistic individuals because there have been very few studies that look at this. And for the visual system, we see that for the basic vision, once again, acuity matures at about age 4 to 5, but there are other aspects of vision that are constantly being adjusted and fine-tuned as we age. For instance, we don't peak in our ability to recognize individual faces until we're about 30 years old. And then once we hit about 40, those abilities begin to degrade. And you might need more glasses and you might have a harder time distinguishing between different people. So if a person is experiencing hyper-reactivity, you will see signs like they are frequently covering their eyes, or they might cover part of the page when reading so that they're not overwhelmed by all the words in front of them. Signs of hypo-reactivity could include difficulty finding objects in crowded environments, or waving objects in front of their face to get more sensory input. For tactile or touch systems, the tactile system is functioning at birth, but it does become more fine-tuned as the system learns to integrate with the other senses. So as we get better at vision, as we get better at our sense of balance, touch system will adjust and fine-tune throughout development. However, our tactile system does begin to degrade at about age 55. That's partially due to things like collagen, elasticity in the skin being reduced. So if a person is hyper-reactive to tactile, we will see things like they resist or shy away from physical touch. They might have strong reactions to certain fabrics. Whereas signs of hypo-reactivity to touch could be a low reaction to pain, or they might seek deep pressure by pushing against others, or Temple Grandin's famous squeeze machine. All of those senses are part of the equation. So let's talk about the olfactory system. The basics of the olfactory system are in place by about 3 months of age. And we get better with experience at being able to distinguish one smell from another. But once we hit about age 65, that ability is dramatically reduced. Signs of hyperreactivity in the olfactory system can include things like avoiding the kitchen and bathrooms, or reacting strongly to particular smells. Signs of hyporeactivity, individuals will seek out strong odors, or they'll excessively smell foods or objects. I'm not sure why the pictures are showing up for some of these, but not the others. But oh well. For the gustatory or taste system, so that actually is constantly changing as we age. So especially young individuals have more receptors for sweet tastes, and it's thought that has something to do with wanting to make sure that individuals like breast milk and eat it as their infants and young children. And then as we age, we become more accepting of tastes like bitter. And in fact, as we get even older, we begin to seek out bitter substances. So if a person is hyper reactive to certain tastes, they will be very particular about food textures. They will be very particular about which foods they like, and they may choose more bland foods because they become so overwhelmed by more spicy foods. These individuals are also more likely to gag easily. Signs of hyporeactivity, these are individuals who may chew or lick non-food items, and they may pocket food in the cheeks, so kind of do the chipmunk thing. And part of that is because we have a number of nerve receptors all along the jaw here, and by putting food in there, we're actually creating pressure against that, and some individuals find that calming, or they enjoy that, and it makes them happier or more energetic to be able to do that. So when you see those behaviors, we have to look more at what are we seeing before and after to know whether this sensory behavior is about bringing them up or if it's about calming them down. And Moira Pena, who's giving the second portion of this talk in 2 weeks, she will talk more about becoming a sensory detective and how to figure out what is the sensory processing difference that's occurring then. Let's talk more about those other systems that we don't hear so much about. So the vestibular system really actually matures around 15 to 16 years of age. When we're first learning to walk, it's definitely reduced, and we see clumsiness in younger individuals, but by about the age of 15 or 16, individuals are usually better at movement and balance. And once we get to about the age of 60, that system begins to degrade. So if a person is hyper-reactive in their vestibular system, they're going to resist activities where their feet leave the ground. They're going to avoid movement. These are also our individuals that may have real trouble with nausea when they are traveling by car or plane. If a person is hypo-reactive in their vestibular and movement or gravity system, they crave movement. These are our climbers, our jumpers. These are the people who rock and can't sit still in a chair. And I'd like to point out that all of the things I listed there are true of children, but they're also true of adults. Many adults struggle with those. So proprioception, or body awareness. So again, this is where my body is in space in relation to other objects around me. The proprioceptive system matures around ages 3 to 4, but it degrades around age 60. It's very rare for somebody to be hyper-reactive in this. How can you be too aware of where your body is? In fact, meditation and other activities are all about being as aware as you can of where your body is in space. But hypo-reactivity is extremely common in proprioception. So individuals who are hypo-reactive, they may stomp when walking so they can get that feedback from the ground. These are our individuals who love to give those hard high fives, or they may have real trouble sitting still and upright in a desk. They might slouch more or lean on things in order to feel where their body is in relation to the objects around them. The interoception, or internal body signals system, is one of the least studied, but the more I learn about it, one of the most important internal sensory systems. So the basics of interoception are usually in place by about 9 months of age. A baby will cry when they are hungry. They will seek out certain experiences. And it is usually intact by about age 6, but it's fine-tuned throughout adolescence. Being able to understand what's happening in our body, especially requires us to go through puberty to understand some of the internal body signals that are happening. But right around the age 60, our ability to recognize these signals is reduced. If a person is hyper-reactive in their interoception system, they will usually have an unusual low pain tolerance. They may be overly sensitive to temperature changes. They may not want to eat too much because if they feel too full, they feel nauseous. These are all things related to being hyper-reactive in your interoceptive system. But for many autistic individuals, hypo-reactivity is more common. So hypo-reactivity, some signs of that are an unusually high pain tolerance, poor awareness of hunger, thirst, or needing to use the washroom. And all of these issues, while present in children, are also differences that autistic adults describe as we talk about the interoceptive system. So let's talk a little bit more about the importance of interoception. It is extremely difficult to treat somebody who is sick if they can't describe where the pain is, if they can't describe the pain itself. So if you have trouble localizing where pain is, or being able to tell that the pain is in the stomach region and makes me feel nauseous versus the pain is in right above the ovaries and you have a cyst rupture, something along those lines, if you are not able to localize pain and you're not able to communicate it, this can lead to serious long-term health complications. And this is something that we're seeing with especially autistic elders. Those that struggle with communication, those that struggle with interoception are not able to tell the doctors when something's wrong, or they can say something's wrong, but they don't know how to help the doctor narrow it down. This also leads to difficulty recognizing signs of anxiety, and that can lead to shutdown or burnout. So if I'm not able to recognize that my heart is beating faster, if I'm not able to recognize that my breathing is becoming more shallow, or I'm getting clammy skin, or my muscles are tightening, if those signals are not being recognized in my brain, I'm not going to be able to recognize that I might be on the verge of an anxiety attack, or being on the verge of lashing out at somebody because I'm frustrated. So without recognizing those internal body signals, I'm not able to adjust my behavior or leave the situation to prevent the eventual outburst or frustration. And if you're not able to recognize that on a prolonged time scale, if I don't know I'm having anxiety every single day for days on end, that can lead to burnout. So the interoception system is involved in sensory processing, as I mentioned, but it's also involved in things like self-awareness, the emotional guidance of social behavior. So am I recognizing that I'm anxious when I'm having this conversation with a person and that I need to adjust either how I'm reacting to them or remove myself from the situation? And interoception is also involved in regulating the nervous system. When I decided to give this talk, I wanted to go into every brain structure related to every sensory system. And if we were to do that, this would be like a semester-long course. But one brain structure I did want to highlight, and its importance related to interoception, is the insula. So the insula, there it is. The insula receives and decodes interoceptive input from sensory receptors in our tissue, our organs, our bones, and then it sends that information to the other parts of the brain to allow us to make decisions. That is an overgeneralization, but I hope you get the point. So the insula is extremely important with its relationship to interoception and to the other senses. And more and more studies are beginning to focus on this section and the connectivity. So how that region talks to other parts in the brain for autistic individuals. We do not have as much research in this area on adults as we would like, so I'm hoping that will change in the future. So let's summarize and then we'll talk future directions. Some autistic individuals have more connections in the brain in their sensory areas, and some autistic individuals have weaker long distance connections between areas that are far apart in the brain. This combination of too many connections in sensory areas and weaker connections to other areas may lead to hyper and hypo-reactivity to sensory information. Some autistic individuals have trouble understanding information from multiple senses at once and need extra processing time to put the information together. Oh, it lost one of my bullet points, but the bullet point was supposed to say interoception sensory systems and in adults have not been studied, as much as we would like. So it's much harder for us to be able to draw conclusions about how sensory processing changes across the lifespan. But we do know that they don't go away. Autistic individuals that are children eventually grow into autistic adults. And we need to be able to recognize that challenges don't go away. What might have changed are coping strategies or masking or camouflaging strategies, but that doesn't mean they've gone away. In fact, that can lead to things like burnout if we're not addressing the underlying sensory issues. So we've talked sensory processing, brain development, sensory systems and aging. Now let's talk about the limitations of what I just shared with you and future directions. In the sciences, and this is not just autism research, this isn't even just psychology research. In the sciences, we have a reproducibility crisis happening right now. What do I mean by that? Researchers are not always able to replicate findings from previous studies. So it makes it hard to draw firm conclusions about something if we're not even able to prove that it happens in another group of people in the way that a different researcher previously published. This is especially an issue in autism research, however. It may be partially due to the fact that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the autistic population. So many of you may have heard Stephen Shore's quote that if you have met one person with autism, you have met one person with autism, and that's absolutely true. Everybody is an individual, and what is true of even a small group of autistic individuals may not be true in another group of autistic individuals. So it makes it hard to really draw firm conclusions when we may not even be studying the same individuals with the same issues to begin with. Another problem with all of this research is that many of these studies require individuals to do things that may feel invasive or may overwhelm them on a sensory level. For instance, certain tests require an individual to sit for a long period of time or wear certain equipment. And if you have sensory sensitivities, you may not be willing to do that. So all of the studies that are published have already been narrowed down to a small subset of the autistic population who is willing to tolerate those conditions. And then another issue is that when we talk about sensory processing differences, many of the ways we measure this are by self-report or having a parent fill out a questionnaire saying, these are the reactions we observe. My child really has a hard time with audio or with auditory processing. And this can be a problem because, especially if somebody else is filling it out for you, they don't know what you're experiencing on the inside. They might say, oh, my child has no problem with it, when in reality, that child has just gotten better at masking. This is not as much of an issue with self-reports, but once again, if you don't know to recognize certain signals in your body, you might not realize that you do have a sensory processing difference in that area. So these are all limitations to how we can interpret the results. So what do we do about it? Well, for researchers, we need to start utilizing the technology that will allow more autistic individuals to participate in experiments. And I just noted the time and I'm going too slow, so I'm going to go a little bit faster here. So there are fancy new eye trackers that don't require you to wear bulky glasses and keep your head in a chin rest. There are EGI systems that allow for us to not need to do those painful little head scrapes to get the electrode right against the scalp. And there are mock MRI scanners that allow individuals to practice what they are doing in the before they actually get in a scanner, so they're not overwhelmed in the moment. One of the most important things we can do as researchers is to start to design studies in collaboration and partnership with autistic individuals. Nothing about us without us. We need to make sure we're including them at every level of research. There's a course put out by Kids Brain Health Network and McMaster University that teaches researchers how to better engage and collaborate with families and individuals when they are designing their studies. And I was very excited to see this. The International Society for Autism Research, or INSAR, has recently opened up something called the Community Collaborator Request, which will connect researchers with autistic individuals who are interested in a topic and want to work with the researcher right from the start. So for resource development, we need to collaborate with autistic individuals every step of the way. We need to make sure their voices are front and center. We need to collect feedback from a variety of autistic individuals, not just have one token person providing their feedback. We need feedback from lots of people, and we need to make sure that the strategies are actually useful to the people who are going to use it. So these are some examples that I will include in the slideshow that Denise will post, but essentially these are examples of some programs that have done that. We have Dr. Emma Goodall's Ready to Learn Interoception Kit. This was a great activity that was delivered to all classrooms that taught interoception and self-regulation skills. And it reduced the number of kids who were sent home, all kids, not just autistic kids, all kids who were sent home by 80% by giving them those skills to recognize what's happening inside their body and learning how to calm themselves. Dr. Wen Lawson is helping AIDE Canada to turn it into an online course. The Sensory Processing Differences Toolkit, is a resource that was developed by Moira Pena, again, giving her talk in 2 weeks, and self-advocate Elspeth Dodman and myself. And it provides a neuroscience background, tips on how to become a sensory detective, and strategies to try at home. So we also have a teaching interactive social skills course. This was developed by AIDE Canada, and autistic collaborators were involved every step of the way. It provides practice for social interactions and tips on how to read facial expressions and body language. We don't have time for the video, so I'm going to skip that, but just trust me when I say it's a great resource, and I hope you'll check it out. Closing thoughts: let's give people with autism more opportunities to demonstrate what they feel, what they imagine, what comes naturally to them through humor, the language of sensory experience. As we learn more about autism, let's not forget to learn from those with autism. There are poets walking among you, and they have much to teach. All right, we will now go into questions, and I'll see how many we can answer. I apologize that I went over time. Okay, so I have a question here. What causes sensory issues? In general, it's that over-connection and under-connection within certain sensory areas and how the communication occurs within the brain. I hope I answered that question during my talk. How can we help autistic kids in natural disaster or war? Speaking about autistic kids in Ukraine, do you have any resources or ideas? Building some toolbox. Yes, that is something that we've been talking about lately. The number one thing I would say is try to find some way to create buffers around sensory information. So noise canceling headphones, visual schedules, things that can reduce anxiety are how we can best support individuals as they are living in these difficult situations. Daughter is now 20. She has always had echolalia. Will she ever be able to lose that? Any suggestions for how to assist her? So echolalia is more related to speech language pathology. So I would strongly suggest you consult with a SLP. That is not my area of expertise, so I'm sorry I cannot offer more advice than that. Do the hypo or hypersensorial senses change or evolve through time, even not including a therapy? Yes, they can change over time. As I mentioned, as we develop, our senses change in general. Some individuals do find that they no longer have the sensitivities that they once did, and they didn't do a particular therapy for it. They just don't experience it to that level anymore, while others, like I mentioned, have just learned how to mask it. So it's very individual, and it varies by the sense within the individual. So they might still have trouble with interoception, but they might be better about loud noises. Does the hypo or hyper, can the use of a sensory stimulation room help, where the patient can modulate the amount of stimulation to a comfortable level? There is evidence that it helps some individuals and that it doesn't help others. I will suggest that you attend Moira Pena's talk on strategies for dealing with these issues in 2 weeks. She will dive into that more than I can. Are there therapies that help change the sensory differences permanently, more than accommodating them? Again, let's talk to Moira about that in 2 weeks. There are some things that claim to have done it, but the evidence of it being generalizable to a larger group is still lacking at this moment for certain things. But certain sensory integration activities can help overall, and some people do find that they no longer need accommodations as they age. Neuronal migration be seen on imaging scans. In order to get the pretty pictures I showed you, we do need to actually cut up the brain and do a special stain on it. What we can measure when a person is alive in scans is the connectivity. So which areas of the brain are lighting up at the same time as other areas, and are they happening on the same time scale as others? So we can see clues of that with regards to connectivity, but the neuronal migration itself and being able to measure how many cells moved into a higher layer, that's something that we actually need to cut up the brain to do. I think I already answered the hyper or hyposensitivity, vary time to time, moment to moment. Absolutely. Depends on what's happening around you, and did you have a bad day? Did you not sleep well? All of those things impact how we process sensory information. What or where is the filtering mechanism? How to improve that? There are activities that can help you learn how to focus. I did a very quick talk about the Interoception course that Wen Lawson created, and part of that is teaching you those skills to be better at filtering out that information. Things like mindfulness can also help with that process. Can music help in the integration of information in an autistic person? I think it can help some individuals. For others, it may be more overwhelming to have additional sensory information here. We're all individuals, and some of us do better when there's something soothing in the background and it allows us to connect what we're doing to that soothing moment. And for others, it's just extra information that they can't handle at the moment. Can somebody be hyper-reactive to one stimulus and hypo-reactive to another one at the same time? Absolutely. A person may be hyper-reactive to a tag on their clothing, but they might still be seeking sensory input in the form of a really hard hug or jumping on a trampoline, something along those lines. Can you please recommend materials? Yes, so the Sensory Processing Differences Toolkit I mentioned on the AIDE Canada website, we have a whole list of resources at the end of there with additional reading. I would highly recommend you check out that list, and Sensational Kids is on that list as well. The PowerPoint will be available. I gave Denise permission to do that. Auditory system, hyper info you are presenting the same as auditory processing, or is that different? It's the same. Auditory processing is what I'm referring to when I talk about the auditory system. Can you share the studies or references of that studies to help for hyper? There are a number. I would suggest the talk with Moira Pena will dive a little bit more into that and provide the strategies that I think you're asking for in your question. My baby is alert to small sounds far away, but she also is very loud and shouting. How can I help her? Should I create a quiet environment? What that tells me is that she's sensitive to certain sounds far away, and that might be overwhelming her. So she might be choosing to control the sounds that she is exposed to by doing those loud noises. I would really think about becoming a sensory detective. And again, that's in the toolkit, and Moira will talk about that in 2 weeks. But really look at when is she doing the activities, and pay very close attention to how she is reacting after she has done that. Is she calmer, or is she more alert and more excitable? Being able to know what's happening right after that activity will tell us what purpose she had for banging on those pots or whatever it is she's doing to make those louder noises. Who should we see to diagnose sensory processing profile the best, as well as interventions? Is that OT, or is there a specialist who has even more advanced knowledge on this? I highly recommend seeing an OT specialist who has training in sensory processing differences. So when you're looking for OTs, make sure to ask, do they have experience with autism, and how do they approach sensory processing differences? If they don't have a very good answer for you, chances are that's not their area of expertise. But if you're looking to find this out, an OT specialist is your best bet. Is the severity broadness of SPD, so I'm assuming you're referring to sensory processing disorder or sensory processing differences, associated with autistic social symptoms? Is the severity broadness of SPD associated with IQ? With regards to sensory processing differences, we do know that the more sensory processing differences a person has, the lower social competence they'll have, so that it is absolutely impacting social abilities, which makes sense. If I have a hard time focusing on understanding what you're saying in a moment, I might not recognize that somebody is becoming agitated with me, and that I should maybe change the course of the conversation or take a step back. So yes, absolutely, it impacts social competence, and the association with IQ is a bit tenuous at this time. So I don't feel comfortable saying one way or the other. I think we need more research. My kid memorizes the entire context, including all sensory received. If any one of them changes, it becomes a new learning memory. So learning and retrieval becomes that much more difficult. Is this a right understanding? Absolutely. When we learn, we put the information of the context together, and that gives us an idea of what we can expect. If a sensory experience is a little bit different each time, then that can lead to anxiety, or because we're not able to predict what's happening. So you'll see this all the time with kids in school. They'll not even notice the school bell ringing one moment, but the next day the school bell startles them and hurts their ears, and they cover their ears. And it really has to do with the lack of predictability, because they are paying more to sensory experiences around them. And so when one little thing changes, they're seeing it as an entirely new situation. What do these sensory findings suggest about potentially helpful, important modifications in delivery of medical care, procedures, tests? How can physicians and techs be more proactive in what they do and how they do it? I love this question. It is absolutely an issue that shows up all the time. And at AIDE Canada, we're actually developing a few resources specifically for doctors to help with this issue. But the number one thing I can suggest is to make great use of visuals, visual schedule. First, we're going to do this, then the next test, then whatever it is, use a visual schedule so that you can reduce anxiety. We tell doctors whenever possible to make sure they're in a quieter room. We know that fluorescent lights can be overwhelming for a number of autistic individuals. So if we can use some other light in a room, that's helpful. And physicians and techs can also help by being calm, not rushing individuals, and explaining everything they're going to do before they do it. So I'm going to check your knee to see if there's an injury. If it hurts, you can raise your hand or give them some tool to be able to indicate what's happening for them. This is especially important for individuals who do not communicate using spoken language. And I will mention AIDE Canada has a toolkit for families who are regular visitors to the emergency room that gives tips. And we even have a questionnaire you can fill out called "This is my child." And you can check all of the sensory sensitivities that a person might have so that you can communicate that ahead of time with the doctor. And there's less confusion on how best to support your child. Olfactory system. We are using aromatherapy as some smells, for example, lavender, help calming our son, now 35. Could you please elaborate on this? I think that's great. If it calms him, fantastic. The interesting thing about the olfactory system is that it is very much tied to memories, and it doesn't go through the exact same roadways in the brain for the brain to know what's happening inside, so, or for the brain to be able to interpret it. So the act of smelling something actually very much is connected to the hippocampus, which is where memories are formed. And so you may notice if the lavender occurred, or the experience of lavender is associated with calming, then just smelling that can take you to that state of calm, or at least remember that state of calm much faster. The opposite side of this is if something bad happened and there was a certain smell in the room when that happened, just that smell can trigger that level of anxiety. So there is a flip side to it. You talked about connections between areas of the brain with regards to neuronal pruning. Less pruning entails more connections between areas close to the part of the brain, but less strong connections between different parts of the brain that are further apart. Is this the only cause of less neuronal pruning, or are there other factors that cause less connection between these brain areas? Is there a brain chemical hormone that can help this process and ensure stronger connections between various parts of the brain? I am not aware of a hormone treatment that can help with the process, but ultimately what it comes down to is practice. If you want to make those pathways stronger, we need to engage in activities that allow us to make those pathways by doing it over and over again. So if I struggle with visual processing in social environments, practicing those skills, like for instance, the course we developed with interactive video skills that points out face expressions, that's based in the science. And the idea is by practicing and showing people what to look for, we can help strengthen those associations with the brain and make those pathways bigger. To cause pruning or improve the pruning process is, I'm not aware of any treatment that can claim to do so at this time. How would you understand what is behind inadequate chewing of food, leaving the stomach with more work in digestion? I would think that that has something to do with the sensory processing of chewing food, or the person may like the feeling of a larger amount of food going down the throat. This is where an OT specialist or even an SLP, because they focus on swallowing, this is where consultation with somebody like that can really help narrow down why it is the person isn't chewing their food as much. Perhaps they have a jaw issue and their jaw just gets tired from chewing, so they just want to say over with it and just swallow it. So you would really need to narrow down the reasons for that, and a specialist can help with that. Do contradictory hyper systems coexist commonly? For example, my son avoids fast speeds or feet leaving the ground, which would be examples of hyper, but stomps and hard high fives, hypo. Similar contradictions with other senses you've covered. Absolutely. Individuals can bounce between hyper and hypo all day long, or be more hypo in one aspect of a particular sense. For instance, never recognizing physical pain, or like a sunburn or something along those lines, but may really recognize a different aspect of the same sensory system. This happens for the same individual even hour to hour. And it really is about, if we think back to that chart I showed before, they may have overshot. They may have done an activity that brought them too far up or too low. And so the constant back and forth is about them trying to get to that optimal attention and arousal window. Can the interoception system also be able to be aware or recognize that you are hungry? If they are unable to recognize signals from their body, could this lead to further health complications such as eating disorders or complications due to lack of nutrients? Absolutely. The interoception system, one of its jobs is to let us know when we're hungry or let us know when we're too full. And if you have problems with that, this can absolutely lead to long-term issues. The interoception course that we're developing with Wen Lawson for the online environment, expected June, that course has some tips on how to teach individuals how to recognize hunger signals or what they need to do to keep track of their needs that way. Higher threshold for external pain, but lower threshold for internal pain like GI issues. Is this possible? Absolutely. Once again, we have lots of different nerves that are involved in this, and some of those nerves can be hyper, some of those nerves can be hypo, or it may be that the signals are getting sent to the brain, but the insula or other parts in the brain are not recognizing them to the same extent that it would be recognized in a neurotypical individual. The therapies I've read about for individuals who have hypersensitivity to food textures all seem to involve eating new foods and new textures and slowly building up tolerance. But if most of these processing difficulties are permanent or semi-permanent neurological differences, then exposure therapy won't actually resolve the difficulties. Do you know of any other kind of treatment or resource for dealing with this besides grin and bear it? There's a balance to be struck when you're dealing with this particular issue. I would suggest you look at the feeding differences toolkit on the AIDE website. It goes into some of these issues, but with regards to building a tolerance, we have to accept that some people just don't like certain tastes. Some people just don't like certain textures, and it can have nothing to do with autism in itself. I don't like certain mushrooms. I don't like the texture of it. That doesn't mean I have to change that behavior entirely, but we do want people to have a more varied diet. We do want people to get the nutrients they need. And so sometimes it's about being creative about how to get them those nutrients so that they're not dealing with having to eat something that they hate the texture of. So smoothies or things along those lines. But it is important to challenge people in a way that excites them. So, for instance, making small changes to food and seeing what they like and what they don't like. And you don't have to push them. It's about offering options and seeing which options the person is willing to go with or they're not. And you can offer an option, they might be against it, but then 3 weeks later you offer the option again and they are, they like it more. So definitely check out that toolkit that can help walk you through the process, but it is possible to increase food variability, but at the same time, make sure we're respecting the individual's preferences. And we especially don't want people to get sick because we're forcing them to eat a texture they don't like. So it's really about providing opportunities and not forcing somebody to do that. What are the best interventions to improve the interoception system? This is an area that has not had a ton of research, and the most research I've seen is that interoception kit that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So I would highly suggest you look into that. But ultimately, interoception is about getting you in touch with your body. And so activities that can help regulate your breathing, help you feel your body in space, so push-ups against walls or things along those lines. As we learn how to better recognize where our body is in space, I know that's proprioception, but it's tied into interoception. As we learn how to do deep breaths and how to recognize when our heart rate is elevated or lower, these are things that will help interoception in general as we learn those skills. Just for the few questions that are up there, yes, the slides will be available and the presentation will be posted on the website later. Today, I do not know if the link will be sent via email, but you can go to the website and then copy the URL. Are there sensory profile assessments geared towards those who are visually impaired or blind? That is a great question. Essentially, there are a few questionnaires out there. There's the SPQ2, so Sensory Processing Questionnaire 2, and there are questions that are available. I do not know if they have been altered to allow for text to speech. So I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that, but if not, hopefully somebody can assist with those particular questions. So neuroplasticity doesn't help with sensory integration. Good to be prepared. I mean, sensory integration changes over time and our brains are constantly changing. So I wouldn't say that it doesn't help. I would say that things change over time and we are going to have to work, we will have to practice sensory integration as our brain ages. I hope I'm answering that question. How to understand the underlying issues of sensory processing. How can we help? Do you believe in sensory integration by OT? There are some sensory integration approaches that have a lot of evidence behind them, and using an OT specialist is a great way to figure out what it is we can best do to support an individual. I can see the anxiety of my son about school. He is 13 and in middle school. He's very nervous when he is around by teens. For this reason, he is super attached to his aide. If the aide left in the middle of the school day, he would melt down, disturbing class, showing aggressive behaviors such as flipping his desk. How can school staff and I work together to help him reduce the anxiety and behaviors? That sounds like a difficult situation, and it sounds like he has a great deal of anxiety in general. I would suggest first working on some of the anxiety. So techniques to use when you're feeling overwhelmed. Self-regulation skills can be helpful. We do have a toolkit on that as well on the website. But ultimately, what it's going to come down to is once he has more skills on how to self-regulate, it will come down to slowly building a tolerance. So maybe she sits a little bit further away for just a few minutes of the day, and then slowly increasing that time so he can see her, but she's not right next to him. And then maybe she's allowed to exit the room for 30 seconds and comes back in. So as we slowly build a tolerance, hopefully that will help. But I would strongly suggest starting by helping him learn how to address his anxiety from the get-go. There seems to be a discussion about saying someone has autism versus autistic. That is a conversation that is outside the scope of this particular talk, but I will say I default to autistic first because numerous studies have shown that when you ask autistic individuals, the vast majority prefer to be referred to as such. It took me a while to switch my brain over to that because I was so used to using person-first language. But as those studies came out and as a few journals published that they had a preference to also start with calling somebody autistic as opposed to person with autism, that is when I switched my language as well. I do recognize that this is a controversial area, which is why I just went with the majority in the studies. Where may we find a list of resources and links you referenced? They will be in the slideshow, but I will also send them as separate links to Denise, and she can add them. Does sensory overlap with ADHD? Absolutely. We see all sorts of sensory issues with ADHD, and many of the things discussed here also apply to individuals with ADHD. Can aggression be a sign of sensory problems or overeating? Absolutely. Aggression is a reaction to being overwhelmed by either an emotion or something that's happening around you or inside you. So in fact, when an individual is showing aggressive tendencies to themselves or towards others, one of the first things we need to look at are there any medical causes for this? Are there any sensory issues that are triggering this behavior? And so that's when I would suggest you become a sensory detective and really dive into what are the causes, what's happening before this behavior, and how does the individual respond after they have engaged in this behavior. Are they calmer or are they more alert? And really becoming a sensory detective can help you narrow down what's causing the behavior. 16-year-old son is still having bathroom accidents. How do we help? This is something that happens for a lot of individuals. If you struggle with interoception, being able to recognize when you need to use the washroom can be a problem, especially if you're one of those individuals who gets hyper-focused on something. It's like all other things around you go away and you don't even recognize internal body signals because you're so focused on what you're doing at the moment. And this does happen. I would suggest things like using timers or to make sure that the individual is going, every 2 hours or whatever the case may be, just to help prevent those accidents. And then looking at helping to teach them the skills to recognize that they have a full bladder. So, if you push on your stomach right now, how does that make you feel? Do you feel like you have to go more now that you've pushed gently on your stomach? The Interoception skills course coming out in June also has some tips related to that. What interventions help with hypersensitivity to sounds? An OT specialist can really walk you through these, but in some cases, it's just developing coping strategies, like allowing the individual to have headphones in, noise canceling headphones, or they make some of these earbud headphones that can filter out background noise and just focus on the speech. So finding tools to help can really be useful. The other thing that some people will try is gradual exposure therapy. So only at a certain decibel and then increasing the decibel of the sound of a crowd or something along those lines until they feel more comfortable. There's some question about how useful that can be in the long term, and are we triggering anxiety by doing that? That's where consultation with a specialist can be extremely helpful. I believe I've answered some of these. How do I know a child has sensory challenges? Well, many autistic individuals have sensory challenges. What I would look at are the reactions to certain issues, and doing the sensory detective tasks that Moira will point out in 2 weeks and are already covered a bit in the toolkit we created. Sensory challenges are true for many of us, even neurotypical individuals. And so it's really about looking at the situation and seeing, are they attracted towards certain activities, or do they avoid certain activities, and then narrowing down what it is about that activity that is causing them to become overwhelmed by sensory information. Is severity or broadness of sensory processing differences associated with the core social communication impairment? There have been a number of studies that have indicated that yes, the severity of SPD is associated with communication impairments, which makes sense if you think about it. If I'm overwhelmed by what's happening around me, I can't pay attention to the complex social interactions that are happening at the same time. With regards to association with IQ, I think I mentioned that there are some indications that yes, it is related to IQ, but there's been some questioning of that lately in the research. So I don't want to say for sure, but in the past, studies have indicated that is the case. My baby never cries for very wet diapers or poop. Is this interoceptive, hypoactive, or skin touch? It can be both. If it's more touch if it's outside of them, but also just not recognizing that the signals from the touch receptors do go to the interoception system, and that insula that helps make sense of it all. So I would say that it's probably a combination of both, but touch for your child may be hypo-reactive, and you might find that changes with time as they develop, or they may always struggle with recognizing that their clothes are wet and just need to be taught how to address it without necessarily recognizing that they're uncomfortable because of it. What is the assessment that specifically target these sensory issues? OT specialists will focus on, they'll do a number of questionnaires, they'll observe the child, they'll put them in different sensory situations and see how they respond. So that is where an OT specialist comes in. Oh, what type of medications are suggested to reduce sensory difficulty to calm the child down? I am not a medical doctor, so I can't say the specific medications, but I will say that for a number of individuals, what it comes down to is they're having anxiety around the situation, whether it's being overwhelmed by sensory information or the unpredictability because every situation feels different to them. The Bell example I gave before. So some doctors may prescribe anxiety medication in those cases, but that is definitely an individual by individual basis. We don't have a medication specifically for, making sensory processing more muted for that individual, so they're not so overwhelmed. But we do have anxiety medications that can sometimes help with that. What type of investigation can help us parents to help autistic children or ASD kids? So brain scans can help in some ways, in that you might be able to see which areas of the brain are more active in certain situations. These are obviously extremely expensive tests, and because, as I mentioned before, there's so much heterogeneity, there's so many differences between individuals, being able to concretely say, oh, my child has more activity in this region than another child is really hard to do, because when we look at these, we compare it to group results. So, and then if you're part of a study, because of the ethics procedures behind those, we don't give specific recommendations based off of what we're seeing on a brain scan, because all of the results are usually grouped together. So the most I would suggest is, if an individual has epilepsy or something along those lines, EEGs could help determine what are some of the sensory related issues for the seizures. Implications for evaluation tools like VIDS and eligibility for support services like Medicaid waivers and SSI in the US. I don't know what VIDS is, and that question is outside of my wheelhouse. The most I can suggest is to speak to a doctor and see what they think is available, and maybe again speak to an OT specialist and see if they can suggest something. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that one. When a smell or taste brings back bad memories, is there a way to reverse that over time? What you can do is try and just expose a person to small amounts of that smell while doing something that they enjoy. So for instance, if the person doesn't like the smell of a particular food, but they really love this video game, maybe have the video game or the handheld console in the kitchen and only just briefly open a container of the food that's not heated, and then slowly increase it that way. Moira might be able to help with that as well. There was a recent study on autistic anxiety, with it showing a difference between neurotypical anxiety and autistic anxiety on brain imaging. Can you expand? I'm not sure which study you're referring to, but there have been a number of studies focusing on anxiety. I would hazard to guess that we're seeing more activity in the amygdala and in the insula region for autistic individuals compared to neurotypical individuals. And this probably can be related, or this might be related to things like overconnectivity or underconnectivity with other regions in the brain. So if we're not able to have as strong of connections to parts of the prefrontal cortex, we might not be able to calm ourselves down as easily. Sorry, I would need more information and to read the study to be able to really dive into it. But I would hazard to guess that it has to do with the connectivity between regions in the brain that process anxiety and regions in the brain that help us calm ourselves down. What do you think about Brain Gym? Our OT recommended it. I'm not familiar with that particular one, but I'm positive Moira will be familiar with it. So I will let her answer that question. My son sings songs unclearly, but he is still nonverbal and doesn't talk when we try to help him do so. So far, he will just repeat what you tell him. How can we encourage him to actually respond? A speech language pathologist will be helpful with that. I would suggest trying to get him to sing his responses, or maybe singing your questions to him. That could be a way to approach it. The other possibility is just giving him other tools to communicate. So a whiteboard or an iPad or a text system or something, so that he can communicate his needs, and then maybe trying to sing that to him. We have to meet individuals where they are. So if singing is how he's vocalizing right now, let's try to capitalize on that and expand it. I'm glad people are enjoying this. Thank you for the kind words. 1-year-old baby gets super excited after undressing prior to bathing, jumping and toss turn at bed, and also during dressing after bathing. Is this sensory related? I would say there's some sensory happening there. There could be an issue related to the feel of the cloth. So maybe see if you try different types of clothing, tightness, heaviness of the clothing. Do you still see an extreme desire to get out of that clothing, or are they more comfortable? This is where trial and error and being a sensory detective can really help. The Canadian website organization with resources is aidecanada.ca. So AIDE Canada.ca. We are funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada, and we have been around for a couple of years, but really went live with our website in September of 2020. So most of the resources on our website are extremely current because we haven't been around that long. Are you familiar with near-infrared spectroscopy as a brain imaging method for persons with autism? I am familiar with it. I have not myself done any studies related to it. Some individuals do find it's easier to tolerate those testing conditions for scans as opposed to being in a different type of scanner. So for some people, it does work very well. I have not actually done any experiments using it. My experiments were primarily with eye tracking and then some EGI. I'm looking at your website and cannot find the toolkit for the emergency room. I go to the find section, and we might call it emergency department. It's not always emergency room in Canada. It's often called emergency department. Sorry about that. I'm from California originally, and I use the two terms interchangeably. So maybe just type in emergency in the search bar and it should pop up.